Thank you for your interest in this lecture from Lectica. My name is Theo Dawson. I am the Executive Director of Lectica, Inc., which has a nonprofit mission to improve education by changing the way we do testing. Changing testing changes everything. In this lecture, I'm going to describe Lectica's learning model and its implications for education and assessment. There are three main points I'll be making during this lecture, beginning with what many of my colleagues have called a no-brainer, which is that if we wish to continue to thrive in an increasingly complex, challenging, and changing world, we need well-educated brains, for the sake of ourselves and for the sake of our societies and our world. A well-educated brain has rich, well-integrated neural networks. As I'll be explaining here, these are cultivated through action, reflection, and analysis in what we call virtuous cycles of learning. I'm also going to show you that by supporting virtuous cycles of learning, educators everywhere can help learners build these robust knowledge networks. In so doing, they'll be leveraging our natural motivation to learn, cultivating reflective dispositions, and importantly, embedding the skills that we require for ongoing learning and development, so we become individuals who can continue to learn robustly throughout the course of our lifespans. I'm going to begin by talking to you a little bit about what learning is not. Learning is not a process of simply pouring lots of bits of knowledge into a vessel and hoping that somehow all of those bits are going to coalesce in a sensible way. This way of thinking about learning has been called a naive model, because until the beginning of the 20th century, when the learning sciences began to get a foothold, it was the primary way in which pretty much everyone thought about learning. The types of knowledge associated with this way of thinking about learning are facts and procedures. The primary intellectual activity is memorizing, and the forms of instruction are lecturing and demonstrating. Today's high-stakes testing, intentionally or not, reinforce this model because these tests focus primarily on factual and procedural knowledge. But knowledge is also not simply about getting higher. What I mean by this is that learning should not have as its primary goal learning faster, getting higher scores, or attaining a higher level of development. Although these are legitimate long-term ends, they should not be the immediate goal of instruction. The immediate goal of instruction should always be learning. Learning takes place in the brain, inside a vast and highly complex neural network, a dynamic, living network. What that means is that everything that happens in the brain involves some kind of synaptic activity. That's why our brains light up in fMRIs. Concepts, ideas, skills, all of these things exist because of connections between neurons that we build up over our lifetimes. You think, "Mother?" and your brain lights up like a Christmas tree. Ideas are not located in a place. They're a light show. Learning is about making, reinforcing, and pruning connections in our brain. Given this view of learning, the primary aim of instruction and assessment should be building robust knowledge networks. How are ideas constructed in the neural net? One way to explore this is to look at how they are constructed over time. I'm going to use an example from adult learning to illustrate. In this first slide, we're looking at part of a conception of good leadership that's pretty typical among entry-level employees. The new idea is a notion that appears for the first time at a level of development that the average North American achieves in late adolescence or early adulthood. Think of this example as a tiny snapshot of the neural network, in which the idea that good leaders have good people skills has emerged from a network of knowledge that includes a number of precursor ideas constructed at an earlier developmental level. Building blocks, if you like. The new idea is made possible by the presence of these building blocks, and the quality and number of these building blocks determines how robust this new idea is, how well it will serve the learner in daily life. In this slide, we're looking at part of a conception of good leadership that is more typical of upper-level managers. Here, the new idea is creates dynamic teams, and the idea of good people skills is one among several building blocks, each of which was constructed at an earlier developmental level. These two slides represent a small segment of several learning sequences for good leadership that run from grade 4 to Einstein. In fact, by studying how people learn important concepts like leadership over the course of the lifespan, we have documented learning sequences for over 200 conceptual strands, all of which show this pattern of construction. These learning sequences make it clear that the richer and more integrated our knowledge networks are at one level of development, the more likely we are to build robust networks at the next level. In fact, when we do a bad job helping students construct their knowledge networks, we prevent them from reaching their full potential. You might say that laying down robust neural networks in early life is akin to building the foundation for a skyscraper, and that failing to do so is as serious as skimping on the quality of a skyscraper's foundation. In other words, we need to ensure that children build robust networks that are rich, deep, and well-connected enough to create the conditions for a lifetime of learning. To do this, we have to treat every educational offering as a new element to be integrated into the network. If we can do this effectively, we can help learners build knowledge networks that are not only robust in terms of the demands of the moment, but also in terms of laying down the foundation for learning that's to come. I like the skyscraper analogy for more than one reason. I like it because it makes it very clear that teaching facts and procedures isn't enough. We can't afford, at any point in our learning lives, to forget the importance of building robust foundations. It also makes it clear why learning faster or getting higher should never be our immediate educational goal. When we adopt these as immediate goals, it's way too easy to neglect the quality of the network. And when we do that, we undermine long-term growth. Now I want to tell you about my experience with 500 babies. I practiced midwifery for many years back in the day. And during that time, I was privileged to catch 500 plus gorgeous little babies. As I watched them grow up, I became fascinated by the fact that every single one of them, without a single exception, learned to walk. The reason I found this so fascinating is because learning to walk is really hard. It may be one of the hardest things we ever learn how to do, because for most children, it involves many repeated instances of falling down and getting hurt. I have personally witnessed babies falling down a dozen or more times in a single day. And even though they may have gotten seriously hurt, even if they broke a limb, they were right back at it. These babies behaved exactly like addicts. I wondered then, what was happening in their little brains that could explain such behavior? And that brings me to the dopamine-opioid cycle. You may have heard about this cycle within the context of addiction research. It is indeed the cycle that's implicated in addictive processes. But what you may not realize is that the dopamine-opioid cycle is the natural hormone-driven motivational cycle that supports learning. This cycle is hijacked in many ways by things like addiction to substances, video games, and the media. Unfortunately, after students start school, it's not as often leveraged in the interest of learning, which ironically is what it was originally intended to support. What is the dopamine-opioid cycle, and how does it work? Dopamine is called the striving hormone. It makes us want to learn, to achieve, to explore our world. That explains why those babies wanted to get up and try again and again, even in the face of adversity. Opioids, on the other hand, make us feel pleasure. When we've arrived at our goal, a release of opioids makes us feel a sense of well-being or joy. As long as the dopamine-opioid cycle is ticking along, learners remain addicted to learning. But there is a catch, and that is that there is a balance between striving and success that must be maintained in order to keep the cycle going. If a task is too hard or too easy, the cycle breaks. For the dopamine-opioid cycle to run optimally, the difficulty of the task that's being undertaken needs to be just right for a particular learner in a particular context. This is the Goldilocks zone, and it just happens to be aligned with what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development almost 100 years ago. It's our learning sweet spot. Before we go on to learn more about virtuous cycles of learning, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we mean by robust knowledge. There are 3 things that contribute to robust knowledge. The first of these is breadth. Breadth is about how much you know, the facts and procedures you know. It's about facts, concepts, and things. These ingredients of the naive model are important in any learning model. They're not something we want to toss out. We want to keep them, but we want to keep them in their place as only one component of a more complete model. The second component for building robust knowledge is what we refer to as depth. This involves how deeply we understand what we know. The depth of our understanding reflects how well connected our neural networks are, not only in terms of facts and procedures, but in terms of our reflective analytical capabilities, self-regulation, and our understanding of ourselves and others. The third component is quality, of course, because if we want to function effectively in the world, we require a knowledge network that reflects something like reality. Clearly, we need learning experiences that support our ability to create accurate networks. The other aspect of quality is more relative. It's about how adequate our knowledge is relative to the task demands of the role that we find ourselves in at the moment. It's important that our knowledge networks are a good match to the environments that we find ourselves in and the tasks that we need to perform. If you're engaging in a highly complex task in a changing environment, then the task demands are going to be much higher than they are if you're participating in a relatively simple or regularly repeated task. How do you build robust knowledge networks? Well, first, you need access to the high-quality factual and procedural knowledge that's going to provide breadth. What we mean by high-quality knowledge is knowledge that is accurate and reliable. This requires that we, as individuals, build skills for determining whether or not we're working with high-quality information. With respect to depth, what we're looking for are frequent opportunities to apply new information that comes in, for example, through activities like action inquiry, problem-focused learning, or collaborative learning. There are a number of existing approaches that can be used to provide learners with opportunities to apply information. The reason that it's important for us to engage in practices that build depth is because it's through the application of new information that we have the opportunity to network that new knowledge into our existing networks in a way that ensures that we not only can recall the information later, but can begin to use it to solve problems or to engage with the real world. Finally, we need to focus on the quality of what we have learned. This requires regular feedback and intentional reflective analysis about what we've learned and how well we have learned to use it. This component ensures that we have properly networked new information into our knowledge structures by allowing us to prune out connections that don't work for us, while reinforcing the connections that are most useful to us. Only when all of these components are present, and we're in the Goldilocks zone, can we build optimal neural networks. The best way to ensure that we're working all of the components required for building robust knowledge is to engage in what we call virtuous cycles of learning. As you can see from this graphic, the cycle incorporates all three components. We call the first phase of the cycle seeking. Seeking can take the form of being instructed, but it also includes all of the ways in which we acquire information. We think of new information as a new piece of the puzzle that can contribute to the development of our knowledge network. The most important skill that's associated with this phase is the ability to evaluate the quality of information. The second phase in the cycle is application. This is where we work this new piece of the puzzle into our knowledge network by applying it in some way, through activities like writing, experimenting, building things, action inquiry, and critical discourse. The most important skills associated with this phase are those for engaging in a range of application practices. The third phase in the cycle is analysis. Here is where we ask, how did that go? Did the effort that I just made return the result I had intended? Was it accurate? Was it a good mapping? Did the other people involved think it worked? Do I have evidence that it worked? This is where we have the opportunity to prune our knowledge base. By pruning, I mean that we can disconnect connections that are suboptimal and reinforce connections that are optimal. The skills required in this step include skills for seeking and making use of feedback, an awareness of cognitive biases and skills for avoiding them, and mindfulness and self-monitoring. We also need to cultivate a disposition for exercising these skills. We call this reflectivity. There is one more component to the cycle, and that is goal setting. Based on what we learn in phase 3, we set the next learning goal. Goal setting can be accomplished in a number of ways, many of which involve some kind of external support. For example, it can be done with the help of an instructor, mentor, or expert, direct feedback from the environment, feedback from peers, or feedback from diagnostic assessments. What kind of learning experiences are most likely to support virtuous cycles of learning? Here are some examples from the 20th century. As you can see, we are by no means the first researchers who have discovered the virtuous learning cycle. We are the first to take it seriously enough to make it our mission to formulate a scalable approach to assessment that supports this model, however. Why? Because we believe that every assessment that a student takes should support learning and development. We have no right to waste students' time with tests that offer nothing more than a ranking system. Consequently, we believe that ideal assessments should measure the breadth, depth, and quality of knowledge networks and reflective analytic skills, while supporting the development of those networks and skills. And they should provide diagnostic information that tells learners and educators what comes next. So learning is optimized. This requires exhaustive research into how people learn tested skills over time. Lectical assessments are designed to meet all of these requirements. Well-educated brains are characterized by rich and well-integrated neural networks that are cultivated through information acquisition, application, and reflective analysis in virtuous learning cycles. When we support virtuous learning cycles, we help learners to build robust knowledge networks while cultivating reflective dispositions that will take them into the world as lifelong learners, and by embedding the skills required for optimal ongoing learning and development. At Lectica, we build assessments that are designed to support the development of robust knowledge networks by engaging virtuous learning cycles for everyone involved: learners, mentors, instructors, administrators, parents, anyone who's involved in the learning process. They provide objective diagnoses of developmental needs with respect to a particular set of concepts or skills. And finally, they help educators and mentors to evaluate and increase their own effectiveness by examining the amount and quality of learning that's taking place in their programs. Thank you so much for listening to this lecture from Lectica Inc. I hope it's been an interesting information gathering experience for you, and that you will find many ways to apply this knowledge and analyze outcomes. Happy virtuous cycling!